So I really want to sort of ask the panel, first of all, you know, the IoT Security Foundation released this report last week about the fact that 90% of consumer IoT companies have no form of method for a security researcher or anyone, for that matter, to contact them to let them know there's an issue. So, you know, I want to get the panel's thoughts on those. So obviously I would like to start with Laurie because you deal with this on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, of course. So yeah, 9% of IoT device manufacturers have a VDP, a vulnerability disclosure program. So at HackerOne, we run about 1,300 of these, and a small minority of them are on people like Toyota and General Motors, like Intel, people that make things rather than software. And we obviously think that everyone should have a VDP in place, anyone that's producing software, anyone that's producing things. And we have guidelines on how to do this. One of the interesting features that I saw in your report is that when you look at the companies that have these responsible disclosure, these kind of VDPs in place, they tend to be large tech companies, so the Amazons and the kind of Microsofts out there. And it tends to be the smaller companies that don't. And for me, the question is, like, is it financial or is it awareness? Is it that they're lacking in resources to do this? Because if they are, it's really easy to do a VDP, right? You can just have a security at email address, a policy, and a method of resourcing it, so you're actually responding to it. So it's interesting, and of course we think that everyone should have one. Yeah.
So, Beau, I mean, you're heavily involved in the security research community. I saw you in uniform, as it were, wandering around DEF CON. I'll let you explain that.
I was wearing a mad scientist costume, running the Biohacking Village's medical device research lab, which basically meant we got a bunch of security researchers who were out at DEF CON together with some medical device makers, got them into the same room, had them have these conversations about you know, what happens when I find something. The device makers brought devices, and we had people actually trying to find bugs. No one there found any, but we were all set up with you know, the phone a friend line, with HackerOne, with CertCC, with these other coordination groups, to basically shrink that gap between researcher discoverer and the receiver of that. So how do you bridge that gap? I think, well, one of my first experiences with finding vulnerabilities in IoT was over a decade ago when I worked at a hospital and we had a bunch of our medical devices go down because some commodity malware hit it via a well-known vulnerability in Microsoft Windows stack. Back then, who would have thought that, you know, medical devices are running Microsoft Windows? Microsoft had already issued a patch for it, but the manufacturer of the medical equipment hadn't applied it. So I tried to figure out who to talk to and ended up just getting stonewalled at the sales or support line, right? Which is the only way I had to report it. Now, the healthcare community has, I think it's a law, it's some kind of a regulation. If I find a tampered bottle of aspirin on my shelf at the store, or if I have a negative reaction from a pharmaceutical or a medical device, I can call them and report it. But until recently, until the FDA started forcing them to do it, basically, medical device makers didn't really have a way to take reports of security issues. They said those aren't reproducible, they're not real world, and they essentially dismissed them. What we found, though, is that by getting that vulnerability information to the IoT makers, they're then able to identify other things, identify root causes within their products, reduce future support lifetimes. They're able to then spread that knowledge and information to the rest of the community and the ecosystem, so other medical device makers don't make the same mistake. So there's a huge amount of benefit, and it all starts with kind of opening yourself up to taking reports and then having some way to investigate and work them on the back end.
So Dominique, I mean, you work in the sort of, I was going to use the word lofty, but, you know, Ivory Tower might be another one that sort of popped into my head there. But, you know, you work in international policy circles where people talk about these topics and they talk about nation-state attacks and hacks, but how connected to the real world and the real world of security research do you think that people in those circles are? Is there a lot of awareness?
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot of tension between what we've heard already today about the multi-stakeholder approach to standards making and then the multilateral approach, which we have to acknowledge still exists at the UN level. And unfortunately, at that level, I very rarely see people who are actually engaged in building, developing, making software, or running businesses in this area, but are more driven by state mandates and state agendas that are very different from state to state and country to country, right? We heard about the US, which tends to take Europe tends to take the American approach, and there tends to be a lot of cooperation, but there are other states that are more worried about obviously losing control of IoT devices as they get deployed and losing control of their citizens as well. So it's quite a broad spectrum that I'm seeing.
So what's your view on this sort of vulnerability disclosure environment? Is there an understanding that's the right thing to do? Do you think that government involvement would help consumers or something else?
And internationally, in terms, again, of multilateral institutions, I haven't heard too much discussion about it. Obviously, people I know, even you, for example, we talk about it. And I think one point that I was just thinking about with the both of you mentioning it, Beau also mentioned it, until there might be a little bit of regulation to sort of mandate it, I don't think we're going to see a big uptake in it. But it seems like in the medical industry, there is already sort of best practice as well as a mandate of that.
Yeah, the FDA, so the FDA did a cool move, which was, it was like a carrot-shaped stick. So they said, if there's a vulnerability in your product that could cause harm. In other words, there's an unmitigated pathway to causing harm, not just any vulnerability. Then we're going to treat that like a recall because effectively it is a risk to life and safety. But if you have a coordinated vulnerability disclosure program, if you learn about it and do something about it quickly, if you tell us about it later, if you meet all these criteria, then you don't have to treat it as a recall, which means the investors really care. So they used a clever trick that way to drive the industry towards it. Now, it's not truly a regulatory requirement, but it's in manufacturers' best interest. And we see there's probably now at least a dozen, probably close to 20, that have a coordinated disclosure policy published. Many others don't publish it. But there's about 1,000 medical device makers, so the majority of them have not jumped on board with it yet. Of course, the majority of them are like 10-person companies, so they're really, really small.
So in terms of, I was really amazed by the work that NIST are doing and the huge breadth of the work you're doing under this program, and I probably wouldn't sleep at night if I had that level of responsibility.
Well, I coordinate. I'm not responsible for it all.
But it's very impressive. Do you, how do you marry up the sort of needs of the security research community, the policymakers, and the standards community? Just in the United States, never mind the rest of the world. How do you manage to bring that all together?
Through lots of engagement. Lots of putting drafts out there and, allowing people to comment on it. In some cases, we're actually looking forward to this new baseline document. It escapes me now the name of the configuration management tool, but we plan on making the document public, and we're going to allow folks to actually comment on it, redline it, real-time work on it. So we try and work cooperatively, having a history in standards development and standards engagement. You've worked in standards, your negotiating skills can become quite honed working in standards work. So it is definitely a broad breadth of work that we do.
Do you get when you ask for public feedback, do you get individuals who are interested in these topics giving you feedback? Or?
Oh yeah, we have individuals. We have, like I said, we have a lot of industry associations that comment, but we also have individuals. And that's part of kind of when I stood up the program, I recognized not everybody can get to Washington, D.C. Not everybody can attend one of our workshops, which is why, my family's kind of disowned me, because my team and myself, we actually travel around the globe as much as possible. We try to do a lot of conferences and sessions at academic institutions because we feel those are more accessible to people who can't necessarily pay the $600 fee to get into CES or RSA. But we also try to go to where we think we'll find that community of manufacturers. It can also bring the perspective around, hey, it has to be cost effective. In order for me to sell it to my board, in order for the people who are responsible for the governance of this organization to see the value in, let's say, a vulnerability disclosure program, I have to understand how to sell it to them. How does it feed into their risk processes? How do they evaluate making an investment in that? How do they establish a policy, an organizational policy to actually do that? So a lot of it's not technical, and I like to always talk about that. So that's why we try to go out across a breadth of organizations, not just talk to the technical folks at RSA.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting you mentioned RSA. So some people in the hacking community, outright refuse to go to RSA and vice versa, right? So it's good that we are kind of bridging the gap, right? There are people who kind of move between the two communities. I mean, Laurie, what things do you think we can do to sort of bridge the security research community with governments?
Yeah, so we have for VDPs, there's no invitation process. Anyone can participate. It's naturally public. But we also run Bug Bounty, which is where you incentivize it with money, and we do have an invitation system there where you can invite people. And the important thing there is that people can reject the invitations, and they'll reject it based on the policy. So we do a lot of stats on why people reject invitations. And so from that, we've come up with like a few guidelines for people who are thinking of embarking on this journey of doing a vulnerability disclosure program or indeed a bug bounty. And we talk about like the 3 Ps, and one of them is promise, preference, and process. So the promise is kind of like saying what we're trying to do here, like what our kind of mission statement is. The preference is how we're going to receive these vulnerability reports. Is it through an email or online form, or in what format do we need this? And then the process is in return, what are we going to do for you? Like what SLAs are we going to maintain, for instance? Are we going to respond within a week? Are we going to remediate it within a month? That kind of thing. And then the 2 S's, which are scope and safe harbor. The last one is quite important for some of our researchers in Germany, Sweden, a lot of these legalistic kind of countries. And it basically says that if you submit a vulnerability report, we promise that we won't sue you, we won't take you to court. Yeah. And so companies that follow, and international organizations, governments, whatever, that follow these guidelines tend to have the least rejections, I guess. Yeah.
You maybe should have like an evilness scale.
Yeah.
Perception of evilness.
Yeah.
But that is the problem for security researchers, isn't it? That they often get into difficult situations with companies and have nowhere else to turn, right?
Yep.
And they can't. Sometimes they don't want to go public because they don't want to expose those products and the consumers to the issues that they found.
Yep. So my first experience with responsible disclosure, probably 7 years ago, was one of these electronic light bulbs, IoT light bulbs, and I was working for a consultancy. We extracted the Wi-Fi code, and we could do this from anyone's house, right? And we reported it to the manufacturer, and they didn't get back to us. We waited, I think, 180 days in the end before we published a blog post. And a day after we published the blog post, we got the lawyers on the line threatening us. And it was just a really zero-sum game, right, at that point. Whereas if they'd have responded and we could have worked with them to help remediate it, it would have been so much easier. I think probably most security researchers have been through this process once or twice. Yeah. And unless you work for a reputable firm, it can be a real barrier to reporting this. And in fact, I think we did a study recently that said 1 out of 4 of our researchers, and we have about 300,000 registered, know about a vulnerability but haven't reported it for this very reason.
Yeah, I mean, I've been in that exact position, and I know that had I disclosed it, the company would have reported me to the police.
Yeah.
Actually, interestingly, just last week, there was an interesting case involving York City Council, and it was really interesting, the police response. So so Troy Hunt, a very famous security researcher, explained what had gone on, and the York City press release had said, yeah, we've reported this issue to the police, and the police came out and said, no, security research has done nothing wrong. They did everything right. And so the police got a lot of plaudits for that. And it just shows to me how public institutions are actually gaining the trust and confidence of the hacking community because they're starting to understand who the good guys really are, right?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And I think NCSC, the British government, are embarking on a VDP at the moment. So they're one of the few European states that are doing it. I think there's 5 out of the 27/8 member states of the EU that have this, yeah. There's also the European Union Cybersecurity Act is being drafted at the moment, which may contain passages on a VDP for software manufacturers.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to make sure that the audience has a chance to ask some questions. So, straight away. Okay.
Yeah, my name's Saab Sembi. I'm from Virtually Informed. Question for the panel. I mean, considering developing these products is not cheap, security is not cheap, remediation is not cheap, and a lot of IoT products are developed by small businesses. What do you think either the government or someone somewhere can do to help a lot of these small businesses get over that hurdle? Because I think some of the mistakes that happen, they're not intentional. It's through lack of information, advice, etc. And for them to try and do something about it is very expensive for them if they don't understand security. And most of the people building these devices didn't get into security.
So are we raising the bar of security too high for small businesses?
So that's one of the aspects of the work that we're going to do around the baseline, is engage across the stack to kind of understand where are we striking the right balance. Do we need to create categories of baselines so that we can be able to say, hey, if you don't want to build security into this device, that might be fine, but then it means it's not appropriate for XYZ use because it doesn't have that. We believe in a multi-prong approach, and I talked a little bit about the NCCOE, but that 200-page document that we publish, it's really intended for those people who do not have a cybersecurity expert in residence to be able to pick up something and say, okay, if I buy this and it's off the shelf, I may not have to be an expert myself. That's the new project that we're doing around consumer products. We're planning on publishing guides that a small, medium-sized business can pick up and say, okay, I can buy this and I can buy this, and I can check the box on, if there's going to be 12 requirements, I can check the box on 8 of them, and this is how I configure it. Understanding that not everybody, and we recognize that larger businesses, they probably don't need our guide. They have their own residents, and they can figure out how to solve their own solutions. And we also think that there's an ecosystem approach. We're actually, there's some work that we're doing around MUD, which is the manufacturer's usage description. It's looking at how can we leverage certain components, like maybe a router, to actually mitigate some risks and take the burden off the device and potentially move it elsewhere in the ecosystem. So we think it's a multi-pronged approach, and that's why we're at least not looking at that this is all about the device. We're hoping to provide lots of solutions that industry can pick up.
Do you think there's a role for the open source community in developing some tools? I mean, there's lots of tools that are available for free at the moment in a whole range of categories, but not for security, for IoT.
Probably it's an area that we've talked about, but we haven't really moved forward with it. But I completely agree. I've heard that quite a bit.
There's lots of open source tools to break IoT.
Yeah.
I'd say, look, cybersecurity, we tend to say, oh, it's so expensive. Well, there's more and less expensive security components and capabilities you can put in. I think the role of something like the guidance that you're talking about is to shape the small businesses who are developing the IoT products towards less expensive and more secure options. And then also stepping back and looking at it through the entire life cycle. If it's an extra $5 for the IoT manufacturer. It was really expensive in IoT manufacturer land. And they pay that for each device versus they have a core capability that may be 500 devices or gives them the capability across 500, 5,000, 50,000 versus each consumer is assumed that they will spend an extra $500 on their $25 device. Like that's just not scalable. So like I said, you have greater and lesser costs for doing security stuff. And then you look at the entire ecosystem and say, where is the greater cost and the lesser cost? Where are you going to squeeze? Because the most costly thing is to have no security or the perception of no security, because then few people are going to buy it or few people are going to rely on it, depend on it, except for fairly trivial applications. But you won't have, if people didn't believe the airplanes were secure, they wouldn't get in them. If people didn't believe that they were going to get the best care at public health institutions, they wouldn't go. And that's where the real cost to society comes. So I think no matter what the cost is to the manufacturer, sure, it may drive some of them out of business who are maybe not the right fit for market, but the cost to society is going to be way, way less by figuring out where those costs should go. Today, they're almost 100% on whoever buys it and has to install it, maintain it, et cetera, except for some of the higher end devices. And that may not be the best place for it to be.
Okay, right, next question from the audience then.
Hi, thanks. Nigel Hearn from Pentest Partners. We're IoT security hackers. My question perhaps is, I think as an industry, so the people in the security industry, the manufacturers, the retailers, I think we're all ultimately on the same page when it comes to IoT security. So we know where we are today. I think we all know where we want to go to. Governments know where we want to go to. When we start talking about IoT ecosystems, and Kat, you mentioned privacy that's been you're not going to currently look at. Do we think that's something that can be addressed, or is that something ultimately, given the power of the big internet retailers that want all of our personal data? Do you think the disconnect between what I as a consumer expect from privacy and what Apple or Facebook or Google expect from privacy are so separate and different? Do you think we'll ever be able to square that circle and solve that problem, or is that just going to be regulation that goes around and round and round in circles forever?
So basically, are the corporates going to basically exercise their power and prevent consumers getting what they want, right? Question for the panel, Dominique?
Yeah, sure. If that's the case, then I think fewer and fewer people are going to use them, are going to adopt them. I think one of the advantages that you have and that we have in this room is that we're more aware than probably the average consumer about that. But I also think that consumers and users of Facebook and Google, in my experience in the last few years, have become smarter because of all the news and everything. And I think people are making different choices now, right? I know 5 people in the last 2 weeks who've terminated, deleted their Facebook account based on a number of different issues. And I think as the consumers demand different things, right, the companies are going to have to respond or die. I worked for a startup called Yahoo, right? And I always think about that when I was there in the early days, right? Where are they now? They're somewhere in the middle, lost in Verizon, right? And this is why I'm a little bit more optimistic about human ingenuity, because I think even though Google and Facebook are large now, I think there'll be other things that are going to come up that maybe are more privacy focused or more focused on different aspects of security that we've been talking about as well.
Isn't it a bit difficult? I mean, Facebook is one thing, which is quite tied to people's lives. A lot of people want to leave Facebook but kind of can't because their kids are in a group that's on, they're in a member of a sports club that only uses Facebook and stuff. But isn't it even worse for home IoT or consumer IoT where you have this thing that you sort of own? Is it not harder?
Yeah, I mean, there is that too. I think, again, and maybe, Kat can say it as well, as you meet people and consumers, there's going to be a very much more consumer-focused approach to this. I really believe that, or else those companies are not going to continue to exist.
Do you think Facebook will continue to exist?
I don't know.
Anyone on the panel?
So NIST has a pretty robust, what we call privacy engineering program. And I like to say I've been at NIST about 8 years. I started working at NIST as part of the National Program Office around NSTIC, which was the National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace. So we ran about 24 pilots working with private industry, and one of our principles for identity was privacy. And as we were engaging with organizations, we'd say, okay, well, we want to talk to someone who is familiar with what privacy protections, what privacy risks does the system have. And we'd walk into a room, and we'd walk into a room for a meeting with lawyers. And I think that was one of our takeaways, that the privacy engineering program that was kind of part of the pilot team took away is if you do turn privacy into a discussion about compliance and laws, you really end up working with the lawyers, where what we really are working towards at NIST is giving industry tools to understand privacy risks. What are the expectations of the user of my system? Where is what I am doing perhaps diverging from their expectation? And that becomes a business risk for me. That becomes something my board of directors may want to understand, because there could be implications to my bottom line, rather than turning this into a discussion of compliance, which tends to just drive everybody to the floor. And what can my lawyers tell me to do to ensure that I'm meeting the absolute floor and that I can't be held liable? And rather this be a discussion around like security risks. Why do organizations now more and more, the board of directors are starting to talk about security risks, and how do those translate into business risks? Can we turn the privacy risk, I think, into the same discussion? I think that's ultimately, I think, where we would hope at NIST to come.
So Laurie, I mean, you see security researchers disclosing things. Do you see security researchers concerned about breaches of privacy based on what the companies are doing?
So actually Facebook have a privacy bug bounty now as well. So there's lots of different ways that people are approaching this at the moment. And also when you find a vulnerability, like companies like Goldman Sachs, for instance, have got very clear guidelines about what you should extract. So like the first record of a database, no more than 5 personal names, that kind of thing. So there's ideas out there, but it's not been really standardized, I guess, yet. Yeah. And another problem is that if you find a vulnerability that allows you to download a database of personal information, for instance, breaching someone's privacy, the thing is, are you the first person to discover it, and do you even have a method of detecting whether you are? Like, it's really tricky, right? So there's a whole host of things to think about.
Yeah, it seems to me actually PTP can probably answer this one as well, that the whole GDPR thing hasn't been squared off properly when it comes to security researchers and finding personal data. Would that be a fair comment?
Yeah, so the question is, like, what is a data breach? Like the philosophical question. Yeah, so how do you define it? And people have chosen not to define it. I think they're just defining it by the example at the moment. So the idea would be like York Council, for instance, would not be considered a data breach because it's a responsible citizen who accessed 1 or 2 records, confirmed that he deleted the data later. That kind of is the same as a pen test company, really. But then, of course, you have other examples where it's a bit more murky, right? Where maybe someone's downloaded a full database table and then gone to the company and said, I've done this, and then it becomes almost like coercion, and then that's crossed the line. And I think those lines need to be quite clearly defined whenever people embark on these kind of programs and policies. Yeah.
Okay. Any more questions from the audience at all? On my
Conrad from Gamesys. I wanted to pass a comment with regards to what Bruce Schneier mentions as security theater. So on the other hand, we've been looking at safeguarding things, at policy standards, but could there be a risk that take-up of IoTs might slow down? I'm seeing it from another perspective, due to the scare, you know how media act, how media portray things, and maybe because of certain inhibitors, the whole ecosystem might suffer. For example, when the more people use these products, the more there's chance, for example, that vulnerabilities are found within a wider scale. There is more like confidence in a responsible disclosure. But if there is this theater, it might actually adversely affect. What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, so I'll go maybe a little bit away from what you asked and then back to it. But over the past 5 years or so, globally, we've spent about $1 trillion on people, products, services around cybersecurity, and companies tend to have about 100% failure rate with $1 trillion investment. That to me seems out of balance. As we're going increasingly quickly towards coming to fully depend on computerized systems and IoT in things like healthcare, aviation, automotive, shipping, et cetera, those types of failure rates at those types of investments won't work. And I fear a couple of things. The first one is very highly publicized single death or a few deaths from hacking IoT that's going to eliminate market demand for that thing, right? That class of things. So a bunch of people die because of a pacemaker hack. It's not just going to be the manufacturer of that single pacemaker. It's going to be all pacemaker manufacturers. And then that will extend even farther. So who knows how wide across the healthcare or IoT scene it'll bleed. The second thing is there may actually be a situation where the market for IoT security is counter to the market for secure IoT. In other words, built-in versus bolt-on. And when you have that situation, governments right now who are trying to increase the adoption and market capitalization and investment in IoT security or security products in general might actually be eroding trust in the IoT products themselves, which is a much, much bigger market. If people think that in order to own this Alexa, I have to own 5 pieces of security equipment, they're just not going to do it. Either they're not going to buy the Alexa to begin with, or they're not going to buy the 5 pieces of security equipment, so it'll undermine the trustworthiness of the IoT systems that they do buy.
Any other thoughts on that?
No, I mean, I think that's definitely a market dynamic. I think that I've already heard about, I can't talk specifics, but there's some roundtables we've done with some household names, Fortune 500 manufacturers, and they'll say, look, we know we're actually doing the right thing. One issue we have is we're not getting the recognition for doing the right thing. That's part of the reason that I think is part of this, what we call the botnet roadmap that came out last week. One of the actions is moving towards a labeling program for IoT devices, both in IIoT as well as consumer. They want to get credit for doing the right thing, but a lot of it is, we're not worried we're not doing the right thing. We're worried about our competitor, and we're worried about the effect on our business if our competitor's not doing the right thing. Because when that next bad thing happens, nobody's going to buy another connected fridge or a connected oven. It's going to impact the whole market, and that whole little slice is going to completely go away. So I think that's a real market dynamic right now.
Any final thoughts from the panel? I wanted to ask you guys a question, but I'm kind of landing you in it here. Are there any particular products that you think, no way should it be connected? And I'm really putting you on the spot here, but...
Every time I think of one, somebody does it. So, to me, the connected stove is the epitome of craziness. Like, do I really need to be able to put my stove on self-clean from 100 miles away? Probably not. But there are some that I thought were ridiculous that have good use cases. Earlier today, Gil had mentioned IoT sock. Well, to me, it's ridiculous that you would just have a sock that tells you your feet are a certain temperature. I don't know what they do, but I have actually seen that as a medical device, so you can send babies home from the hospital earlier with no degradation in care. The doctors are still watching over them, but they're in a safe environment with family, with friends around, and so they can actually reduce costs and increase the outcomes. They actually can measure increased patient outcomes from that.
Hey, I ski. I want warm socks that are connected.
You'll never lose your socks again.
Sorry, Kat.
No. I mean, I tell everybody this because I've thought the same thing. I'm like, I don't understand why you would want this. And just as an example, I was walking around, it was CES, and I was walking the floor, and everything is connected. Everything is connected. And there were connected wheelchairs. And so I said, well, but isn't the person always in it? You know, why would they need, and so I candidly asked the manufacturer, why a connected wheelchair? And they said, we couldn't even envision the use case, but what we've discovered is there are people who actually want to control their wheelchair from their bed. They have a small bedroom, they want to be able to take it out of their line of sight because they're watching TV. It's very convenient for them to actually be able to navigate it. There's one person that actually jerry-rigged a way to actually get themselves into their car and get their wheelchair and drive it around to the back of the car and load it onto the car. But they said when we built the connectivity in, we didn't even imagine these use cases, right? So it's hard to say what should absolutely not be. What I have heard them talk about, especially in the areas of safety, is they're thinking of saying, well, you know, maybe something that actuates like an oven. It's okay for the oven to be connected and, I don't know, be able to download a recipe automatically to the oven, but don't connect the actuator to the connected part. And lastly, I heard something that's probably not very correct to say, but this was shared by a colleague sitting on a panel, and he says, you know what, connectivity is like spandex. Just because you can doesn't always mean you should. So I thought that was perfect.
As they say in hackers, it's a privilege, not a right.
Right.
So Laurie, anything particular?
I think it's nice to be able to switch off every now and then, yes. I wouldn't want to depend on anything that was essential to my life with a connected device, yeah.
Completely agree.
I heard the horrifying news the other week, Dominique knows this, that apparently Americans don't own kettles.
Yes.
So you're safe from Ken, basically, from the iKettle. But with that, I just want to say thank you very much to the panelists and speakers. It's been fantastic to have you, and please show your appreciation.